Hi, everyone. Welcome to our little Radical Books collective event, How to Write About War. I know we put this together in the last minute, so thank you for joining us. We are still waiting for Billy Kahora, but I'll beam him up whenever he shows up. And he's right here. So let me add him to the live stream. Hi, Billy.
Hi,
Welcome. Nice to see you.
thank you very much.
So I wanted us to talk fast and talk for an hour and not kind of go long into hours and hours of discussion. So what we'll do is end up putting the bios of all of us just inside the comments, and we can just get started on the discussion. I thought we could all introduce ourselves and our relationship to this event. What is your individual investment in this topic? Have you covered war or some form of violence? Have you written fiction about it? I know two people who have been in a war zone, edited a war magazine. Why does this conversation matter? And we can just kind of go around. I don't know who wants to go first.
Billy, I nominate you.
Let's come in. Give me some.
Okay, I'll go first. So, my name is Nadifa Mohamed, and I have written about war, I guess twice at least. So, in Black Mamba Boy, Jama experiences the Second World War as a child soldier for the Italian fascist army. And in The Orchard of Lost Souls, you have the build up to the Somali civil war in Hargeisa in the north of Somalia as it was then. So my own life has been impacted by civil war. We left Somalia before it happened, but in many ways it has still framed my life.
Right. And I think we could argue that The Fortune Men is about a different kind of war, against migrants, against, about racism and so on. Okay. Suchitra, do you want to say more?
Sure. I actually first encountered war not as a writer, but as a lawyer. As a young lawyer, I started working for the tribunals of Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and then I spent time in places. Again, you realize that post-Cold War, you really stopped calling war war. You started using words like civil crisis, insurgency. But in reality, what was really happening is that these were wars happening on the shadow of the empire. And of course, I've spent time in occupied spaces, but also I think in terms of war, Afghanistan was between 2010 and 2013. I spent time in Afghanistan. I was embedded with the US forces in Paktika province. So for me, thinking about war is also thinking about structural injustice that happens around the world. I decided to become a writer much later. I was a lawyer first. And most of my work has been nonfiction and reported pieces. But as Bhakti knows, I'm also thinking about a book of fiction that I'm beginning to work that is thinking about some of these issues. So, yeah.
Billy?
Thanks, Bhakti. And hi again, everyone. So I used to edit a journal called Kwani, and back in 2006, when Kenya went into post-election violence, I helped put together two issues around the conflict that emerged from the elections in Kenya of 2007. And this included something called Kwani 5, which is about 1,000 pages of photography, fiction, non-fiction, essays, interviews around that crisis that almost plunged Kenya into civil war. And I've also written about this in different short stories.
Exactly. And I think when it comes to me, I think, Radical Books Collective is a kind of new avatar of what was Warscapes magazine and we still operate as Warscapes magazine and other things, which was something I co-founded. And the whole idea of Warscapes magazine was to not simply publish things about conflict or war, but to expand war to mean more than just a military conflict, but to kind of view it as a lens into displacement, as a lens into gender, into trauma, all the kind of things that come, that are part of course, the afterlife, but also the before, the lead up to, kind of violent conditions. So I think that, exposed me to a lot of writing. It was also the fact that what we are seeing now is that understanding of war or discourses of war has always been stuck, has always ended almost with the Second World War, and one doesn't pay attention as much to what we know about the wars that came out of the Cold War, all the proxy wars or the weapons flooding and so on and so forth. So part of the imperative of Warscapes, part of the impetus, was very much to move past the paradigms and the endless amounts of fiction, historical drama, TV, movies about the First and the Second World Wars. So, and I think we're seeing some of those framework operating today as well. There is a real disorientation, it seems, around history, what history to fall back on when we observe what Russia is doing in Ukraine, how to ally, which side to take, so on and so forth. So I think, so I think part of also this conversation is about expanding that understanding of war as not just something militaristic, but it's also kind of a larger framework. I'm gonna pose a second question, which I told you in advance that I would ask. I think we've all been angry at some of the coverage of the way things have gone on, especially as writers, editors, scholars of color from, global South or India or Somalia, Kenya. There's been something in the coverage that everyone's been unhappy about. And I think the title of the event is evoking Binyavanga Wainaina's satirical essay, How to Write About Africa, which was essentially, as we know, how not to write about Africa. So maybe we can go around and talk about one problem that's really made you angry this time around with the war coverage of Ukraine, whether it's visual, whether it's written. What's a how not to? What is an egregious thing you've observed?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is the focus on pets. So in Ukraine, there's been lots of adoring sort of reportage about how much Ukrainians love their pets and how many people have brought cats or dogs with them, or the heartbreak of having to leave those animals at the train stations. And it happened with Afghanistan as well, where the British government put a lot of energy, or Boris Johnson put a lot of energy into getting out stray animals that were being looked after by a British NGO. Mm-hmm. And the outcry over the potential for these animals to be left in Afghanistan, in contrast to the acceptance of how people who had worked for the British in Afghanistan were to be left behind, is something that really grates on me, where even an animal's life is seen as more important than the Muslim life or the Black life or any other type of marginalized person.
Mm-hmm. I haven't seen this. I'm so glad I asked this. I would like to be more compassionate towards animals, but I think I choose to take this side. I choose to err on the side of human in this. What has bothered you, Suchitra?
I mean, a lot's bothered me because, from our conversations. I would pick one. I think one thing is the way in which this is all being covered. One of the boogeyman that we are hearing is that this is going to be the Third World War. This is going to be our generation's Third World War. But in reality, if you're someone like me who became a young adult in the shadows of 9/11, for 20 years, we've had a Third World War. We've had the war in Afghanistan. We've had the war in Iraq. We've had the crisis, the war in Syria, now Yemen, not to mention, in the name of war on terror, what has been consistently inflicted on Muslim communities. We know about the detention sites, extraordinary rendition that happened places like Bagram and Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, despite the overwhelming evidence that there has been a war that has engulfed so many communities, the idea that somehow this is going to be the Third World War and this is something that we're going to witness, I find it appalling that even the coverage, the language of it is so bad. And of course, there are other things as well that come along with it. The crisis about documenting about refugees. Within a course of a week, 1.2 million refugees was absorbed into Poland and other countries. When Syrian refugees were leaving, were being it's just it's hard. It's of course it's heartbreaking. It's also brings us to the point that now we have openly European reporters saying that, oh, this is Europe. We are civilized. This shouldn't be happening to us. We are proud that Poland took 0 refugees. I think the rhetoric, the blatant racism, and it feels like the eve of Iraq, and that's, I think, something that we've also spoken about. It feels like 2002, only this was 20 years ago. I was a very young person. I didn't have the language, but 20 years later, it still feels like the eve of the war in Iraq in 2002.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It's become clear to me how much there's a Muslim idea of the Dar es Salaam versus the Dar el Harb, you know, the region of peace and versus the region of war. And that idea is firmly set in the Western European gaze as well. There is a site of war, and that's where war should stay. It should never approach the zone of peace. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the outcry when people from the zone of war come and try and find peace here, where, you know, the boundary is so firmly set and is so gate-kept, then that Muslim idea, which is quite a historical idea, is, you know, from the medieval period of time, but the West has really tried to maintain that in our current age. And I think the shock of blonde-haired, blue-eyed children having to get on a train or sleep on the floor somewhere is a real potent symbol for them of how much they are willing to inflict violence outside of that zone to maintain their own peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at the time I wasn't aware of exactly how it played out, but I think when the displaced were being from the events in Bosnia and the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was a sense that the resettlement and of those refugees fleeing that particular violence was there were simply more that were integrated into Europe and North America, as opposed to migrants from whichever countries who can't even participate in like a green card lottery or something in the US, because there's just already there's an idea that you've already crowded us enough. So
and when you arrive, you bring that war with you. You know, the Polish vice deputy prime minister, whatever he was saying very clearly, these people will work, they will do this, they will do that. How can they work when they've just arrived? I don't even know if their language is similar enough for them to just suddenly walk into these jobs. And how will the Poles respond to people taking their jobs? That will be seen in the future. But in his mind, other non-white, non-Christian people only bring violence, they bring terrorism, they bring crime.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are the embodiment of your war now in their streets, in their homes, in their schools.
Yeah. Billy, yours.
Yeah. What this tells me is a kind of triumphantism in kind of, especially in the Western media, especially perceived ideas of shifts towards Ukraine's support. And for me, that's a problem because it goes back to, I think, what Suchitra was saying, or even Nadifa was saying about depicting this as a grand theater of war. So it becomes again this place that where you've made clear-cut sides without reminding us about just the immediate context that has happened over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
The coup in Ukraine in 2008, how he came into power, what the US has been doing in the Ukraine, and just telling us that, just reminding us that there aren't that many good guys in all this at the global level. That for me, how that's playing out vis-a-vis just what's happening to Ukraine and just the bombing of the flagrant. So Ukraine is paying for that, for that kind of, I think, Western, the media war that the West is waging. That's frustrating. That seems to be frustrating Russia into bombing the city flagrantly, right? So, so there's a kind of media that's being pushed, I find, in Western media that I think is resulting directly in problems in the Ukraine, I think. But the lack of immediate context about the complexity of what has been happening there has also kind of moved away. Yeah, and I find that kind of disturbing.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I think the other I mean the other thing is this is like, as soon as one goes into war mode, and I said this before, our definition of war immediately alters right away. It does become this militaristic space, this theater, this place of combat, and one forgets like the war on women, the war on drugs, the war on terror, that are kind of more technically slow violence, though they're always just as horribly fast and vicious, right? So that definition shifting is uncomfortable for me. And then I think within that, we see all this numbers game, and the most extraordinary, horrifying thing I've observed is some people making charts like the Syria 5 years, only 100 missiles, only these many people. Ukraine, last 8 days, these many things. So this kind of comparative understandings that are so awful, and they're just out there. And part of me does want to say that the social media and the digital is exposing us to more, giving us more information that I didn't have during the Bosnia stuff, even during 9/11. I would say things that happened then. Part of me wants to say that there is something's good, something's changing, but it seems that it just ends up being the reverse. It almost makes it worse, and that suspicion upsets me. I don't know what you all feel, but I don't know what as someone who does consume and does engage with social media, I don't know how to kind of think about its power or its deeply cruel kind of impact, because it is shifting, it is changing how we talk about this, it is moving things somewhat. So I worry about that.
I think we're having conversations like we did when Tahrir was happening in Cairo. We were saying things like, the revolution is here. Twitter is going to be this. Is going to be the revolutionaries. The revolution will not only be televised; it will be live tweeted. And now, 10 years after, you realize that it's not the problem with information. Yesterday, we have access to more information. Information could have been more democratized. But the reality is, I don't think as humans we know how to process information. I don't think we know how to process noise. Because at the time, what we consume is noise. Because every single day, it is 10 things, 20 things, 30 things. Right. And we're constantly reacting. I don't think we have time to understand what happens. I don't think we have the capacity to analyze. I don't think the idea of longue durée is gone. If someone says longue durée is literally today morning till today evening. Like 6 hours is longue durée now. And I think our capacity to really understand, we are all bearing witness. Everybody's now bearing witness. Bearing witness doesn't change things. And I think that is the truth. And we all use this language of bearing witness as if by bearing witness somehow we can. The reality is we bear witness more, but we also, I believe, that have less and less power to affect any change. And I think that's linked to the idea that as individuals, we no longer have the power. I think we've been all changed into consuming surveilled objects and subjects. We
Right.
consume, but I am afraid the power we have as a collective, as citizens, as a community, I just don't know. And I'm not saying this in a pessimistic way. I'm truly, I do not know where we are. What
Mm-hmm.
power do we have today in order to affect real change?
Right. Yeah.
So those are conversations we should have.
Yeah. I think bearing witness is somehow becoming more and more incompatible with framing everything through the lens of emergency. You know, like a lot of these CNN reporters, CNN, CBS, everybody, all of them, of course, are so intent on quickly reporting something that they insist, I'm saying, here I am, this is happening, and, I have to get this stuff out. And so it is okay to say, I have a historical amnesia. It is okay to be a little bit racist. It is okay to be sexist. It's okay to, engage some of these extremely problematic things because, all you're doing is, yes, you're bearing witness. Yes, you're reporting, but it's okay to be sloppy because it's an emergency. And that's the other thing that I find to be a very problematic kind of issue. Anyways, I think, Billy, you were trying to say something.
Yeah, and when spectacle rules and spectacle on top of ongoing spectacle, that even makes that excuse easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because what happens is that everything that just happened is immediately forgotten.
Right.
So that even kind of makes it worse. I also wanted to add, I've been really trying to look for kind of Russia side of things and kind of understanding a lot of things. And someone sent me a Twitter link. I don't know whether I can find it, but just kind of this kind of rationale or kind of understanding of what's going on that just felt so different from anything else I've kind of read, that I found fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think social media, because it concentrates on different things, could help against the grander media theater.
Mm-hmm. You've spoken like a person who's not on social media right now, Billy, which I think at the moment you're not, unless it's unless you're on fake accounts and we don't
I'm
know.
lucky, yeah.
And we're also dealing with two countries that are very adept at information war. The Russians have been engaged in it for, I don't know, 10, 15 years now, and the Ukrainians seem just, if not better, just as good, if not better, than the Russians. So I'm constantly looking at it from a communications point of view, as well as to how Zelensky and Ukraine have been so incredible at this, at messaging, at packaging, at really getting across this inspiring narrative. Where, of course, if you know the background, which I barely know, the history of the conflict, then it's murkier. But people don't need murky, and war is also an opponent of murky. In every war, there's a simplicity to how the story is told. And now that we have all of these young people with drone cameras and 5D cameras, they can go there and record themselves within that context and then put their own quite superficial slant on newsmaking. And that's a lot of what we receive through TikTok or Instagram is about the visuals. It's not about the content so much. It is about the visuals and the way it's packaged.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I haven't been, I was shocked, of course, to see the actual numbers today of how many soldiers have died. Like, it's like, the official number is like 1,300 or something like that. So we can easily double it, I think.
I think it's much more.
Yeah,
Exactly.
So it is shocking. I mean, the other thing, of course, on a personal note, it's like we all the time talk about like the death of like globalized ways of thinking. We are all cosmopolitan. We are all connected. We are in a village or whatever. But it's so easy immediately to have taken our national positions and I just feel so allergic because I've been asked so many times why the Indian Prime Minister Modi is siding with Russia. Somebody told me, if you're going to be doing this event, can you find out why Africans, all Africans, are siding with Russia? It's like, it's a sort of immediate post position taking that's kind of happening.
Factionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, disorienting and really problematic, because I do want to answer to that, but I don't stand for India. I couldn't, I can't, I'm opposed to Modi in every fiber of my being. So it's put a crisis of like alignments and things like that because of people's strange understandings about the Cold War as well, what they think it was, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about historical amnesia. We have another guest, but do you think some of the problematic coverage and social media chaos around this is to do with like just a zero history situation? Like people have just, or is it a deliberate dehistoricizing that war brings about? Or is there really just no training when reporters go on the field, or where documentary makers or journalists?
I think one thing that was very clear for me was that sorry guys, I think one thing that was very clear for me is when I was in graduate school in the US, that the sense of American exceptionalism covers every aspect of it, to the point where I think a lot of the journalistic amnesia or myopia is just drinking the Kool-Aid. People, for example, I remember like I'm going back to Iraq and Afghanistan because so much of that conversation is repeating itself, only now in a different velocity. Even people like Jon Stewart, who was seen as the voice of reason in the Bush war against terror, would still talk about the American military in a very specific way. So one is that even the kind of coverage that is coming from the so-called left, America doesn't have a left, liberal progressive media, deeply problematic. It is propaganda. They do believe they are good guys. And that is one thing. And the second thing is, I don't think they understand history in a way that we experience it. If you are someone who is American, who's always had the capacity to travel, the capacity to parachute into places, the authority, the cultural authority, I think America and Europe to a large extent also have the cultural authority of, because they set so much of the cultural values around the world, you can fly into Belgrade and get yourself a chicken McNugget. I think that cultural parachuting also defines how they tell the stories.
Yeah.
And I think even when you see stories, it's always about everything is often I would get letters from young people applying to work for us or saying that I want to cover humanitarian crisis. But there is no humanitarian crisis. What we have is a crisis of empire and war. We can talk about the trauma, the death, the black and brown people being assaulted by violence, but we never name who was responsible for it. That's true of all of this coverage. And increasingly, it's also true of people from places like India and parts of Kenya and Nigeria, these global citizens who are now traveling, who are black or brown, who are now also beginning to use the same language when they talk about war.
Yeah, this is what I was trying to also add on to the question, is that, I think we are very familiar with the problems that the Western media presents, but to what degree have these now been co-opted also by what is kind of the new media that is, online or wherever it thrives, right? Which is places like India, places like South Africa, where the leaders have gone on and made some crazy statements about what's going on. And, their media is like, India has, I don't even know how many users, people, everybody is, connected and listening and tweeting and writing or whatever. So what are those? What's going on there? It's a genuine question, and it's a distress. It's not clear. What is their understanding of history?
I think it can vary. I think the South's relationship to Russia and the Soviet Union is very different, and that's playing out in the way that people perceive them, especially because for many people, just say people who've been at the other end of drone strikes, what Russia's doing in Ukraine is not surprising, is not shocking, is pretty normal. But I guess if you're living in the West, like we all are, including Billy, I think you're in the UK, aren't you? Then we're torn between seeing quite nakedly how Russia is, the aggressor in this situation. But we're used to superpowers being aggressors. Who gets to determine how much and how far they can go? It's never been us as people from the non-West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Should we get to the topic of this discussion?
Why not?
Right? How to write about war. As you know, Billy, I think you were trying to say something before. Do you want to start with some thoughts on that? The very literal question, or rather manifesto. He's muted. You're muted.
That's what I was trying to say.
Silence is the answer. Yeah.
I mean, when I go back to the conflict in Kenya in 2007, what I distinctly remember, by that time I think I'd edited the Kwani Journal for 3 years. I was used to dealing with writers. I was used to dealing with topics in a certain way, and these were kind of general things around kind of Kwani a lot was trying to find an aesthetic for perceived Kenyan social problems. So that's the program we were on. And then this thing where the country just breaks out into this conflict after the elections, but everybody who called themselves a writer or an editor, immediately what happened, and what I remember is you revert immediately to being a citizen. You forget all that stuff fast. And for a long time, I found myself frozen in terms of just the sheer fear that, well, this country could actually go into civil war. So there's that first.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I find it's very, very important to kind of sort out one's feeling or one's head, because you could easily go in different directions when you eventually come back to try to write about it. So and because the Kenyan one was relatively unexpected, I think there's a kind of preparation that's required of writers. I know journalists are probably kind of trained nowadays to kind of expect these things and work on these things, but that's the first thing first. There's a kind of fear, the very kind of visceral feeling around that moment. Some of it you can tap into to kind of produce work, but one has to be very clear about how they are feeling and what they're going to do with it. There's that. In Kenya particularly, what helped was once again kind of weird foreign coverage of what was happening. So immediately that conflict on Kenya was called a pre-genocide moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the beauty about that was that there was a kind of marshalling by local writers against the foreign press against that, and that brings momentum. The beauty about that was that it kind of made it clear that we have to own the narrative.
As Kenyans.
As Kenyan writers, that you can't let anyone else kind of own your narrative. You really, really have to jump in there and get hold of it. And this stuff happens first, so you have to do it quite quickly. There's also, I think, the whole question around how do you deal with the fact that you're a member of one of the communities where there are sides. There are sides. That's a whole other thing to kind of sort out with. I think it was relatively easy as an editor because all you could do was try and get as many writers from different sides to kind of cover as much of it as possible. But for you as a writer, it becomes a bit trickier. I think there was also the question of if you're a fiction writer and you're a fiction writer of a certain kind in terms of how you see your aesthetics, you find yourself you find those aesthetics becoming almost meaningless because of the fear and because of the seriousness, especially in Kenya, because we were kind of, I think, programmed a certain way. We were a certain kind of set at Kwani that used to talk a lot about writing Kenya in a certain way. Then this thing hits you and you have to think about what happened to my style and what happened to all that nonsense you were talking about, and how do you kind of write straight from the from call it the gut or the heart. So there's a lot of stuff that kind of, I think, goes on. There's also the stuff about the velocity of events, which you as a writer you can barely keep up with. This stuff happens so quickly and so fast that you know this thing they call the narrative stance, because literary writers mostly write from almost from the place of authority of something that has just passed or that is happening as you're writing it. But of course you have control. But these are events you don't have control over. So they're all these, and then you've got to compete against the narratives. In the Kenya conflict, what was going on was a kind of peace versus justice. Everyone was calling for peace, and that gathered a lot of momentum. A lot of people were asking, what about justice? What about all the kind of injustices, historical injustices that have happened in Kenya? How do we deal with those? Of course, it's much more complex than those two things. It's not binary like that. So how do you talk about both things and yet kind of capture the complexity of it? So basically, this is a roundabout way of me talking about how complex writing about conflict can be, at least within the Kenyan context at that time. Yeah.
I haven't covered or written in war. I've been in dictatorship spaces, but I don't agree that the style must go out of the window and the aesthetics. I understand what you're saying. I think you're saying considered writing is difficult, rewriting, revising is difficult, but I think it's all about, I don't think there is such a thing as it's just coming out of your gut. You know what I mean? So I don't know what others feel about.
No, it's not so much that you need to kind of throw those things away. I just feel that there's a kind of indulgent way, at least I used to kind of deal with it before that. And I just,
how so?
Like I felt like I used to spend a lot of time thinking about craft, being more stylish than I need to be, and things just needed to be said.
That's the style.
Yeah,
I know you arrived to that, to offer directness as a part of style. I don't know, Nadifa, Suchitra, whoever.
It's a difficult one, and I'm teaching at the moment, so it's making me think about how other people do it rather than how I do it. And rereading Abdul Razak's books, especially the last novel, Afterlives, which is set in the First World War and just before then as well, and just how much violence there was in that part of the world, and how little known that is, and how there was, Tanzania is littered with mass graves of the carrier corps and the askaris who served for the different colonial forces. And there was a small outcry over that a couple of years ago in the UK, when people who'd served for the British Army were just dumped pretty much everywhere, while the British and even the white German soldiers were given genuine cemeteries with headstones. So that relationship of mass death with mass amnesia is something that I think writers have to find a way of working through. What do you tell people about something that has probably had a cataclysmic effect on their family, whether 3 generations ago, 2 generations ago, 4 generations ago, that they have little awareness of? And in Somalia's case, again, there's been so much different types of violence, one leading to the other, and the way that it's manifested in small ways, in in family violence within a family, or at schools, or in religious schools. People, do you want to write about that with style? Do you want to make it gorgeous? Do you want to make it softer? No, I think even sometimes just describing what has happened is enough. But if you're a writer, that's not why you're doing it. You're not just trying to describe things that have happened. You're trying to piece together some sort of sense out of all of it, and the style is related to that. And I remember with some critics for my first novel, it was too bold in its violence. It was too graphic, and it was upsetting because of that. It was too visceral. But we're so used to looking away from violence, and I was not like that when I was younger. But now I do look away from violence. I can't. There's too much of it. It's too easily accessible. You turn on Twitter and there's a dead body, or some awful, disgusting incident. So I can't do that myself as an individual anymore. So I don't think I could write like that anymore. But I also feel that compulsion to describe things as they happened.
I think I would say, as an editor, this is a very difficult, this is a huge quandary. Because one has control over what you're reading, the desire is to turn the page, turn it. I'll be honest, I didn't read those scenes in your book, Nadifa.
Why not? Why not?
Because I want peace of mind. I want peace of mind.
That's a luxury, Bhakti.
It is a luxury, and I would like to keep it. It is a luxury I would like to continue to have. And for me, I guess, some people react more to it and some others. The child being tortured, raped, whatever, it's not stomachable, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know where we land in terms of expression of violence, because along with that, there's a question of dignity.
Yes.
There is a question of dignity when you are visualizing, when you're narrating certain violent scenes, acts, images. I understand that the war is taking place in Ukraine, and I think the images have been reserved. My sense is that they have been reserved. That was not the controversy when the Dulcet 2 bombings took place in Nairobi, and you saw these bodies slumped over, stomach blood spilling out, and there was all these debates around dignity, right? And who is dignity given to? And the other thing for me is also impact. Just coming out of, say, conversations about craft or literature or literary criticism, if I'm reading something about something where my imagination is allowed to activate how brutal something will be, as opposed to being told blow by blow how brutal it is, what impacts more? Personally, for me, if my imagination is brought into play, it is almost worse, and it's often the case. So yeah, I don't know. Sorry, Suchitra, you've not had a say here. Please go ahead.
It's very difficult for me to think about this because I'll be very candid. Because when I was beginning to write, one of the things that when I was putting together my book proposal, Bhakti said this to me. Bhakti said, "You need I was hiding behind a very academic legal language. And I was hiding behind academic and legal language because I didn't think I had the courage to actually say what I felt. It's easy to talk about grievable bodies. It's easy to talk about the critical theory of visual representation. It's easy to quote, the spectacle and the society. But it's harder to write exactly how you feel and articulate in a way. So for me, I wouldn't even say becoming a good writer, even becoming a writer meant I had to learn how to just write what I was seeing and feeling, and that takes a lot of courage. And, language is, style is the dress for thought, and I think it's very much who we are and how we write. Having said that, I think there is also now a culture where we all write like each other. When I say this, and I've done this with some of my students when I was still teaching, when I printed non-long form creative nonfiction written by 5 Indian authors, all men, all of upper caste, upper class backgrounds. The students hadn't read these essays before. I deleted out their names, the titles of the essays. They were just given handouts that they would read. And the reality was that all these 5 men came from different ages, different political beliefs, different backgrounds. But the students really couldn't tell the difference between who was who. And increasingly, I think that is the problem. I think when I first came here, I was edited out. I used to write these long, maybe this is also the colonial baggage. In school, you're taught a very specific kind of canon. And when I first came here, I would write these long sentences. And then immediately I was told that this is not okay. This is not just, I was told this is bad writing. Maybe it wasn't bad writing. Maybe it was just a writing that was very different than what the average American editor encounters. Because in the US, a good writer is someone who writes like Raymond Carver. I mean, and the point is that we have these hang-ups, and I think that is the second thing.
I really agree. Sorry.
Yeah. And then finally, I think writing about war should never be the same because we all write from a different place. What Nadifa could write about war is very different because Nadifa has lived through war. I have never lived through war. I've had the luxury of bearing witness to many of these wars as a lawyer, as a writer. And Bhakti says that she has the luxury of not wanting to engage with this. So I think, of course, what Nadifa writes is not going to be what Suchitra writes. And of course, what Billy writes in terms of him writing is not going to be what Bhakti writes. But the point is that the moment all 4 of us start writing like each other, which I fear is happening, is the I think go on.
I haven't lived through war. So my family, we left before the war took place. So everything has been through research or interviewing people in my family and beyond who have seen it more closely. And I think probably my feelings have changed, but we haven't talked about the impact of emotions on how you write. The way that you are animated when you're writing about something will change the execution of how you write. And I think there's a gut response I have towards what you're talking about, which is you have to do it this way. You have to be objective. You have to hide the worst details. You've got to talk about generalities. It's very different reading about an incident where 30,000 people were killed in Addis Ababa in the 1930s by the Italians than to actually follow the slow and public death of one person. It has a different emotional impact, both for you as a writer and as a reader. So there is something about, it's a weird combination of the African body being both a public site of violence, like those pictures you talked about from the Doucet attack, to one where one person is completely interchangeable with the next person. So one dead body is interchangeable with the next. And I think I refuse that element. They're not interchangeable. Each death is specific and the responsibility for it is specific. And you can only do that by going into detail and by sitting with it, not looking away. But now I think I've had I will write about war in the one I'm working on right now, but it's not going to be about the war itself. It's more the consequences much later on, the people connected to the individuals who died in that war. So that's a different lens, and one that doesn't ask for graphic descriptions of violence, but the way that once you've been hurt by a war, it enters your bloodstream. It enters the way you respond to many other things. And that is maybe a trickier thing for me to pin down.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Nadifa. I just want to pick off something you said about the impact of one's emotions in their writing. Maybe that's what I meant when I was referring to style versus no style. Maybe what I was talking about is that before the conflict in Kenya, one thought it was better to kind of do this very quiet, this cool, detached, thinking about aesthetics in the way you're thinking about the writing. And once the conflict came, that luxury just disappeared because you are just writing what you're feeling.
Yeah, and you should be.
By all means. Yeah.
I mean, I think the only other interruption I can make to this argument, which all of us in the end feel similarly and are engaged, whether we are looking away and engaging in one way, or whether we are going deep in and engaging in that way, right? I wouldn't say any of us is shying away from the actual things that are going on. But I think the other interruption to that is the perceived audience in mind, right? I think this is different, of course, when it's a newspaper, when it's a tweet, when it's a long work of fiction, a short story, essay. Who is it? First of all, who does one have in mind is an important question within that. But when one knows what's in mind, what is one trying to subvert or change or shift? Are we interested in making that history more visible? Are we interested in the individual death or torture or violence upon the individual bodies? What is the discourse one is trying to shift? Or what should be the questions that this should be approached with, when we think about who we are writing for? Who are we trying to sway? What are we trying to sway?
Bhakti, I used to be very ambitious. I used to be very ambitious in that I believed that if we did this, if we responded, to the acts of injustice, and I think that's also a reason why I left being a lawyer, and I felt that I wasn't performing my task. Justice was not the solution. Justice was never getting done. And when I became a writer, I thought I could shift something. And increasingly, I no longer have those ambitions, because one, the ambition itself, I think, really curtails your capacity to write and think. Now, what I do is, I'm a writer who writes to make sense of the world. I don't write from a place of knowing. I don't write from a place of authority. I write in order to make sense of the world. So for me, writing gives me an opportunity to sit down and think and describe my social reality. Second, I still want to have footnotes in history. I want to be a footnote in history. If tomorrow someone is looking for a footnote, we need a footnote. Because as brown and black writers, those coming from communities where we're constantly being either tokenized to say a story, or become, in other ways, told only we can say this kind of a story, I think what I'm trying to say is that we are constantly being told to give citations for our own lived histories. And for me, perhaps this is a citation that I am creating that tomorrow somebody else could maybe stand on. That is the second thing. And finally, I think writers write. I mean, a good writer, when I say good writer, I'm not talking about style, I'm not talking about upplays. A good writer is someone who is always moved to write. We write because it is a pathological condition. You want to document, you want to archive, you want to take a photograph. Along those ways, you want to try and do it with as much dignity you think you can afford to your community, your people. So that's where I am. I know I'm sounding very upset and maybe even depressed, but I think that's where I am. I don't think we are shifting the discourse. Because we are repeating the same things over and over again. Race and Class 2 years ago published an essay that said, "Is colonialism bad?" I mean, imagine we are debating settled discourse. William and Kate are in Jamaica.
Well, it is depressing, because you feel the echo. We're back in the same repetition dynamic and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I do actively feel, and part of that was organizing this, is that I teach hundreds of students and young people. If I can convert two to just a deeper historical push, or to read something that's not only on, I don't know where they go to read things. I do think that, like, the fundamental education imperative in there should not be lost. I don't think, if I understand it's a pathological condition. One writes, one can't stop but write, but that doesn't mean that the writing is good, or the writing is shifting anything, or that it's activism. I would even say perhaps one should think more than who one is writing for and why one is doing it, right? And not saying don't write, or that you should write only in a particular way, but there has to be some imperatives, whether it's justice, whether it's education, whether it's
revenge is
revenge.
a good one.
I love
That
revenge.
makes me feel good, whatever happens.
That's only on Twitter threads, Nadifa, I think.
Yeah, revenge is hard to gauge the impact of revenge. Has it worked? We don't know, right?
Well, you know, in your heart,
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. For sure. Should we just round out some final thoughts?
Billy?
Yeah, I find the audience question interesting, and I was trying to think when I was doing all this writing, whether it's around the electoral violence, but also I wrote a book about a whistleblower, which is a different kind of, I think, violence, and that's the violence of corruption. But it's interesting. At the time, I thought that writing was about a conversation, and later on I thought it was. I mistook it for a way to have conversations with people who felt exactly like me. And then when I saw that these things hadn't changed anything. By that I mean that the elections continued being crazy with potential violence. Kenya's going to have another elections. I was like, you know what? I just can't do this stuff anymore. I just got tired. I couldn't deal with it. And I've always tried to think about what happened. Maybe I just grew old. But I can't even stand dealing a lot with the Kenyan election anymore. So in terms of writing and in terms of audience, it's just amazing how that can just be can be taken away. And it's not so much answering about audience. I'm just thinking aloud, based triggered by what you said about audiences and what writing means. Because now I think the stuff that I've thought that I want to write about is moving away from that mostly nonfiction stuff that looks directly face onto things, to a kind of novelistic, writing a novel that is kind of removed in a way, but explores things. And I wonder, and I'm still thinking through why I'm doing that. When I the whistleblower book, I swore I will never ever do this again. Just how I felt, like the sheer exhaustion of that stuff and the madness of it. And it's just dealing with all the players and all the stuff that goes on, even just trying to put out something like that. It's just
dealing with Kenyan politics or Somali politics.
Easily 15 years. And 15 years.
Yeah.
You feel like 15 years older after you've done this thing for about 1.5 years.
And it just goes round and round in a circle.
Yeah.
Everywhere though, everywhere. Let's not blame Kenya and Somalia. You should see how Indian violence and the daily stuff is just out of control.
Yeah.
Right. Imagine. Yeah.
It's so bad. It's just like state sanctioned full-on reign of terror that it's just impossible. I don't even know. I mean, Suchitra is much more deeply involved in.
But sometimes it's not even terror or violence. It's just the inability to move beyond certain concepts or basic narratives. I know that's, in Somalia, with Somalia and Somaliland, it's this question of independence. And these people, normally men, who get so animated at the idea of one Somalia or, clan conflicts that have gone on for God knows how long. And they are the people in authority. That is what I find just so frustrating, that I could not engage anymore.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, Chitra, any final words?
Final words. This is something I tell a lot of people is that I remember being in school and India becomes a nuclear power. It was 1998.
I remember.
Everybody that I knew, but as a young, this was someone I was in middle school, I just felt that this was wrong. The moment that India becomes a nuclear power was wrong, that this was just have some dire effects, not only to the country, the subcontinent, the world. But I didn't see my ideas or arguments or my concerns reflected anywhere. In newspapers, by this time, India had a 24/7 news channel. Everybody was telling me that this is it, we had arrived. The capacity to annihilate each other is what is going to put us on the roadmap to superpower, capacities. And then Outlook magazine arrives when Arundhati Roy wrote the essay, End of Imagination.
Yeah.
I read that essay and I knew that for the first time, yes, I was a kid. I didn't know. I knew something was wrong. I didn't have the skills, the capacity, the argument, the language to articulate what was wrong. But I finished reading End of Imagination and I knew that this was it. This was it. Somebody out there was articulating. It gave me confidence that what I felt was right, that the capacity to annihilate each other is not progress. And I'm forever grateful for Arundhati Roy for writing that essay because that changed my world. If not for that essay, I would have very much become a right-wing, BJP supporting, nationalistic human being because as a young person, it's so easy that we are looking for arguments, we are looking for that. I don't claim, I think very few people in the world can claim to have the kind of impact someone like Roy or others have in the world. But that was important because in 1998, Arundhati Roy, I don't know she was this big. I know she had won the Booker already, but I didn't know she was this big.
She was big. She was still big.
She was still. So the point is that I still hadn't read God of Small Things. I knew of her, but that essay changed my political world.
And maybe that's why she stuck to nonfiction for so long, because she was having that impact.
Yeah,
could be.
Yeah.
So that's.
I think the point I will extrapolate as my kind of final thought on it is that war is disgustingly phallic and masculine. So all the morality and the ethics and the politics that comes out of it is disgustingly phallic and masculine. It's all about masculine power, ableist power. And I think unless we can really gender our lens, we can't move at all, whatever, whether it's the shape of the missiles and the drones, whether, all the language around it. I mean, this is like the extraordinary crisis of writing about war is a crisis of gender a lot of the times, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, so I think that's also a big, that's just a huge element in it. And the coverage is exactly as ordained. It's just as masculine and ridiculous as ordained. And emergency gives more shape to masculine morality, masculine action, masculine style, and so on. So, and the women follow that. I'm not saying that the women are immune to it. The women follow that same toxic approach. So the lens has to shift. Anyway, anything else? Should we call this over? I thought this was a lot of food for thought. I don't know as many solutions, but something. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.